They expected me to just be okay with it, didn't they? After leaving everything to my brother, they actually had the nerve to ask for my help. I slammed the door so hard the pictures rattled on the wall. And the next day, I made sure they understood how I truly felt. 30 years old, and I discovered I was essentially a financial safety net they'd happily discard, on a completely unremarkable Thursday afternoon. It's strange, isn't it, how life-altering moments choose the most mundane days to ambush you? I wasn't snooping, really. I was simply helping my dad scan some of his financial documents, a task I'd performed countless times before. At their house, I sat at the computer, and the familiar whir of the scanner provided a background drone to my work. That's when I saw it, a manila folder with "Last Will and Testament" typed on the label. I couldn't resist a peek. A cold dread washed over me as I read the contents. The room seemed to spin. The entire estate, the house, their savings, all their assets, was earmarked for my brother, Tyler. The favored son. The one who could seemingly do no wrong in their eyes. My name was only mentioned in a single, boilerplate statement about loving both children equally. All those years of sacrifices, the thousands of dollars I'd lent them to help them bridge difficult times, and in the end, they'd envisioned a future where I was inconsequential, entirely written out of the script. My hands trembled, a roaring started in my ears. Carefully, I replaced the document exactly as I had found it. My dad called from the kitchen, casually asking if I wanted a cup of coffee. I managed to croak out a yes, but my voice sounded strained, foreign even to myself. How was I supposed to sit there, across from the people who had essentially erased me from their future? I'd always been the responsible one, the daughter who managed their bills, fixed things around the house, made sure my parents, Linda and George, were taken care of. Meanwhile, Tyler drifted through life, still unemployed at 31, perpetually babied by them. They bailed him out of debt time and again. When Tyler racked up $20,000 in credit card debt, finding himself backpacking through Europe, they liquidated their savings to cover it. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs just to afford tuition. And now, I remember how he crashed his car. He got a brand new BMW. Not just any car, but a Beamer that cost more than what I make in a year. Me. At 16, I bought myself a 15-year-old Honda with money I earned working weekends. He, on the other hand, couldn't seem to hold down a job. According to them, it was never his fault. The bosses were always unreasonable, the work was beneath him, his creative spirit apparently couldn't be confined by a regular workday. So, they helped him with his rent while he pursued his passions, which translated to endless video games and a revolving door of girlfriends. I never expected them to be thankful for what I did for them, but this complete disregard was something else entirely. My relationship with my parents had always felt transactional. They never outright asked me for money, oh no, that would mean admitting they needed me. They simply expected me to take care of things, expected me to be an adult while they treated my 31-year-old brother like he was still in high school. Mom would casually mention they were short on the mortgage this month. Dad would bring up the looming property taxes with a pointed look in my direction. They'd marvel at how successful I'd become, how fortunate they were to have such a responsible daughter. But that very responsibility they so admired was really just a tool they wielded to get what they wanted. When I got a promotion at work, their first question was never, "Are you proud of yourself?" It was always, "Does this mean a bigger paycheck?" When I bought my new car, a practical sedan that I had diligently saved for, Dad's immediate response was to ask if I was still able to help with their roof repairs. All the while, Tyler remained their favorite, the golden child, the one destined to inherit everything. I drove home in a daze, the highway blurring into a single, long streak of light. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel. My first impulse was pure rage, a desperate need to scream and confront them. But then, I stopped myself. Why give them the satisfaction? Instead, I decided to keep it to myself. I didn't bring up anything about a will or inheritance. But the very next day, I quietly went to work and cancelled every single automatic payment I had set up. The portion of the mortgage I was covering. Gone. The utilities I was paying for. Shut off. The credit card I co-signed for them, the one that seemed to always have a large balance. Closed. 2 weeks crept by, each day a taut wire stretched between anticipation and dread. Then it arrived, a text. "Hey bud, the property taxes are due." My gut clenched. Not even a cursory, "How are you?" No semblance of an apology, however insincere. Just straight to the point, the endless need for money. I typed a response, my fingers trembling slightly. Tyler should handle it, since the house will be his anyway. The cursor blinked, mocking my hesitation. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I took a slow, deliberate breath and pressed send. Almost immediately, the panic bloomed, cold and sharp. Mom called. Of course she did. I let it ring through to voicemail. Her message, when I finally listened, was exactly as I'd predicted, overly dramatic, dripping with guilt. "Please don't be like this, we need to talk." Oh, now they wanted to talk. Now that they couldn't manage their own finances. I waited a full hour, letting the anxiety fester, before replying with a curt text, "There's nothing to talk about. You made your choice, now you can live with it." Silence descended. A brief, deceptive peace. Then Tyler, ever the peacemaker, chimed in. "Dude, why are you being such a drama queen? It's not a big deal, just help them out like you always do." I let out a short, bitter laugh that echoed in my empty apartment. "Not a big deal? You mean the money you're inheriting? Why don't you use it?" His response was instantaneous, revealing the familiar undercurrent of desperation. "You know I don't have that kind of cash right now." Now money was a problem. The hypocrisy stung. "Guess you better figure it out then, little bro," I texted back, my fingers shaking with suppressed anger. The floodgates opened. A barrage of calls, Mom, Dad, Tyler, even my aunt, dragged into their pathetic campaign. One by one, I blocked their numbers. It would have been easy to stop there, to simply walk away and try to salvage what remained of my sanity. But the anger, the deep-seated resentment, wouldn't let me. I needed them to feel something, to truly grasp the weight of their actions, the years of casual disregard disguised as love. So, I decided to get creative. The house insurance. I'd been managing it for years, a tedious chore I'd taken on to help them out. I logged in and quietly downgraded the policy to the absolute bare minimum. 2 weeks later, a pipe burst in their bathroom, flooding their precious home and costing them thousands in repairs. I sat on my couch, sipping my coffee, and scrolled through my dad's increasingly frantic texts, a dark satisfaction blooming in my chest. It was a petty victory, I knew, but in that moment, it felt like justice. It started with the car. I'd made the mistake of co-signing for Tyler back when his credit was a disaster zone thanks to those endless credit card bills. Silently, I went to the bank and refinanced it, putting it solely in his name. The interest rate tripled, of course. It wasn't long before he was complaining about car payments he couldn't handle. I saw his whiny posts on Instagram, the ones tagged #hardtimes and #anyonehiring, and I felt a twinge of something I'm not proud of, a dark satisfaction. But I wasn't done yet. Then came the HOA. My parents had bought their place without a clue about the strict homeowner association rules. They never bothered with the details, the fine print that governed every blade of grass and every coat of paint. So, anonymously, I reported them for every single violation imaginable. The lawn was too long, the fence wasn't up to code, the paint had faded a little. Within weeks, they were buried under over $5,000 in fines. And me? I slept soundly, better than I had in years. Sarah, my coworker, noticed a difference in me one day at lunch. "You seem different," she said, lighter, somehow. I just shrugged, playing it cool. "Just unburdened," I told her. She didn't know the half of it. No one did. But she was right, I did feel lighter. Like I'd finally shrugged off years of heavy expectations and suffocating obligation. It was about 3 months later when they showed up at my apartment. Mom, Dad, and Tyler, all standing there outside my door, pleading. I opened it, leaning against the frame, crossing my arms. Ryan, please, we need help, Mom said, her mascara all smeared from crying. No, I replied evenly, you need to leave. Mom gasped, like I'd slapped her. You're really going to let us lose everything over this? I just smirked, a cold little smile playing on my lips. Oh, you mean everything you left to Tyler? Yeah, he's got it covered. Tyler, finally pushed past his breaking point, just exploded. Dude, you're being an asterisk. You always helped before, why are you acting like this now? I tilted my head, studying him. Because before, I said, finally letting the truth out, I thought I was part of this family. Turns out, to them, I was just a walking ATM. And now, the machine's out of order. A thick silence hung in the air after that. Then Dad's voice, laced with that familiar condescension, cut through it. We raised you. Put food on the table. Gave you a roof over your head. A sharp, humorless laugh escaped me. Oh, you mean the legal requirements? The absolute bare minimum? Right, my undying gratitude then. I slammed the door, cutting off their rising voices. I could still hear them through the wood, a jumble of anger and desperate pleas I ignored. I poured myself a whiskey, straight, a decent measure. Guilt? Not even a flicker. I had been bled dry for years. And finally they were getting a taste of what it felt like to be on the losing end. For the first time I could remember, I felt a sense of authentic freedom wash over me. Though I was learning that freedom can be a solitary existence. I dove headfirst into my career, snagged a well-deserved promotion, and even tentatively started dating Sarah from accounting, and I made dinner every Thursday night. It was pleasant. Normal. A welcome contrast to the drama that had been my life. One night, lying in bed, Sarah casually brought up holiday plans. Just the mention of family gatherings sent a jolt of unease through me. I told her I wouldn't be seeing my family this year. She gently probed, asking why. I hadn't meant to burden her with it, but the words tumbled out of me like a dam had broken. The will, the manipulation, the feeling of being utterly betrayed, my cold revenge. Sarah listened intently, her brown eyes growing wider with each detail, but she didn't interrupt. When I finished, a heavy silence settled between us. That's intense, she finally said, her voice soft, but I don't think you're quite as at peace with it as you're letting on. A wave of defensiveness washed over me, and I recoiled slightly. What's that supposed to mean? She sat up, pulling the sheet around herself. You check their social media every day. You conveniently drive by their house whenever we're even remotely in that neighborhood. My cheeks burned. Even though I vehemently denied it, she was right. I was still fixated. I kept searching for any indication that they were suffering consequences for their actions. The truth of it landed like a physical blow. I'd severed contact, believing it would liberate me, but I was anything but free. The anger, a corrosive tether, still bound me to them. Sleep was impossible that night. My thoughts spun in relentless circles. What was I even trying to accomplish? What was the ultimate goal here? I craved for them to experience the pain they inflicted, to comprehend the enormity of their actions, but at what cost to myself? The following morning, I frantically called my therapist and managed to schedule an emergency session. I recounted everything to her, the inheritance battle, the thirst for revenge, the hollow emptiness that had consumed me afterward. She listened patiently, nodding occasionally. You're carrying an immense burden, she finally said. It's not solely about the will, it's about enduring years of feeling insignificant. My throat constricted as I nodded, agreeing with her. The crucial question now is, what is your desired outcome? To inflict endless punishment upon them, or to embark on your own healing journey? I honestly didn't know. That weekend, driven by some unknown impulse, I found myself driving back to my parents' house. I parked across the street and simply sat there, observing. The neglected state of the yard, the peeling paint on the house, it was all stark evidence of my subtle acts of retaliation. Then, a curtain twitched. My mother's face materialized in the window. Our eyes locked for a fleeting moment before she vanished from sight. Seconds later, the front door swung open. My hands clenched the steering wheel, every instinct screaming at me to either attack or flee. But I couldn't move. Instead, I opened the car door and stepped out. Mom seemed diminished somehow, her shoulders stooped, her once meticulously styled hair hanging lifelessly around her face. The sound of dead leaves crunching underfoot nearly drowned out her voice when she finally spoke. She told me the house was gone. Foreclosed. The bank was giving them until Christmas to get out. A strange, fleeting sense of, not joy, exactly, but something close to it, flickered through me. Then, the familiar weight of guilt. She went on, telling me Tyler had moved in with his girlfriend, and, unbelievably, was working at the hardware store. I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Tyler? Working? She even managed a weak smile, acknowledging the absurdity of it all. The silence that followed felt heavy, thick with unspoken resentments. Finally, I had to ask, the question that had been eating away at me for months. The will, I said, my voice tight. Why leave everything to him? Her face seemed to collapse in on itself, lines deepening around her eyes and mouth. Oh, Ryan. She began, her voice laced with a weariness that surprised me. We thought you were, okay. That you had everything you needed. You were always so driven, so independent. We thought Tyler needed it more. A short, bitter laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. So, I was penalized for being responsible. She shook her head, her gaze dropping to her hands. They didn't see it that way, she said. Of course, they didn't. More silence, punctuated only by the creaking of the house settling. She then told me Dad was inside, that he missed me, even if he'd never admit it out loud. I seriously doubted that particular sentiment, but I was here, standing in their yard, so I figured I might as well see this through to the end. Stepping inside, the house smelled exactly as I remembered, a mix of dust and Dad's pipe tobacco. But the furniture was different, rearranged, sparser. They'd probably sold off pieces to make ends meet, a grim reminder of their situation. Dad was in his usual recliner, looking smaller, somehow, than I remembered. And older, his hair noticeably grayer. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes widening slightly in what might have been surprise. He spoke my name, his voice rough, almost raw. I simply nodded in acknowledgement. He asked, then, if I'd come to gloat. But the words lacked any real bite, any real anger. They were just, resigned. I shook my head. When he finally asked why I had come, I could only shrug. Honestly, I didn't know either. He nodded, as if what he'd said suddenly clicked into place for him. Then came the apology. For the will, for everything that had led to this point. It didn't magically mend the years of feeling like I was always second in line, never quite measuring up, but it was a start, at least. I sank onto the couch, the worn fabric familiar beneath my hands. We talked, really talked, in a way I couldn't recall us ever doing before. He told me they'd changed the will. Though honestly, at this point, with so little left, it felt almost irrelevant. And Tyler, he said, was finally pulling his weight, holding down a job, paying his own bills. Maybe hitting rock bottom was what he needed all along. I didn't rush back home, didn't resume my role as their personal ATM, didn't pretend we could just erase the past. But I did help them find a smaller, more manageable apartment, and I did help them liquidate some belongings to cover the moving expenses. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, and perhaps never completely. But it was a hesitant step in a new direction, a move away from the purely financial, purely transactional relationship we'd had. When I told Sarah, she was surprised, even a little hostile. She declared she'd have let them stew in their own mess. I knew she was just hurt by them and the feeling was understandable. But, I also knew that letting anger dictate my actions had left me hollow and tired. That Christmas, I didn't visit their new place, but I did send a simple, unassuming card. Inside, I wrote a brief, vulnerable note, admitting I was still processing everything, but that I was making an effort. Later that morning, my phone vibrated. A text from Mom and Dad read, they were trying too. No request for money, no guilt-tripping manipulation, just a simple acknowledgement. It was a baby step, but a step nonetheless. They always say living well is the best revenge. I'm not sure I subscribe to that entirely. But I do know that breaking free from the ingrained, destructive patterns of our past feels more fulfilling than any spiteful fantasy I might have entertained. I'm still navigating the complexities of forgiveness, still establishing healthy boundaries, still figuring out what family even means to me now. But I'm no longer just a walking, breathing retirement plan. I'm Ryan, and I finally feel like I get to decide what that means for my life. The new year felt like a beginning, bringing unexpected possibilities. Tyler's call came completely unexpectedly, an offer to meet for coffee that pricked my curiosity, overriding my skepticism. When I saw him, the change was palpable. Gone was that infuriating, self-satisfied smirk that always seemed glued to his face. He'd actually gotten a haircut, traded his usual t-shirt for a crisp, button-down shirt, and, unbelievably, he was on time. He thanked me for agreeing to meet, then proceeded to nervously fidget with his coffee cup, clearing his throat a dozen times before he finally spoke. Then came the apology. A blanket apology. For everything he'd ever done wrong. For exploiting my generosity, for shirking responsibility, for leaving me to carry the entire weight of our relationship and his life. I watched him, scrutinizing every micro-expression, every flicker of his eyes, searching for any telltale sign of insincerity. But I couldn't find any. He explained that losing their financial safety net had, ironically, forced him to grow up, to finally confront the reality he'd been shielded from for so long. He said having a real job, actually working for something, had given him a completely different perspective, a stark realization of just how much I had been doing, carrying, and sacrificing all those years. Remember when I wrecked my car in college, he asked, his gaze fixed on his coffee. And they just replaced it with that BMW? I nodded, the memory sharp and clear. How could I ever forget? You know what Mom said when she handed me the keys? She said, we have to take care of you because Ryan is already so good at taking care of himself. The weight of those words settled between us, the most succinct and brutal encapsulation of our family's dysfunction I had ever heard. They ruined me, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. They instilled this belief that I was entitled to everything without ever having to earn anything. And they effectively punished you for being capable, for being responsible. I just listened, absorbing everything. I didn't interrupt, didn't offer forgiveness right away. But I did agree to another meeting, a tentative step toward rebuilding something new, something grounded in mutual respect and understanding, rather than obligation and resentment. The new apartment my parents had moved into was small, cramped, a far cry from the spacious house they had lost. But when I finally went to visit them in February, I noticed something unexpected. They seemed lighter, freer. Mom had started painting again, a hobby she had abandoned years ago, a casualty of chasing an unsustainable lifestyle. Dad had joined a book club at the local library, finding connection and intellectual stimulation outside of business deals and social climbing. They had found a quiet joy and surprising simplicity in living within their means. And, significantly, they didn't ask me for money, not once. The change extended beyond Tyler and my parents. Sarah and I grew closer. She seemed to finally feel like she could relax and just be herself. She moved in with me in March, a development that brought me a quiet, unexpected happiness. "You seem at peace," Sarah said one evening, her voice soft as we watched the colors bleed across the sky from our balcony. Her words hung in the air. Peace? Not exactly. Maybe the potential for it. I'm definitely on the road to it, though. She took my hand, a familiar comfort. "Going through everything with your family, it really taught you something, didn't it?" she continued. "You finally understand your own value." She was right, of course. It's a harsh truth, but it took being completely undervalued, betrayed even, to finally see my own worth. To finally grasp that I deserved more than being the family's safety net, the ever-present fallback. The white-hot anger that consumed me initially has slowly cooled, the burning desire for retribution has faded into a dull ember. What's grown in its place is, unexpected. A burgeoning self-respect, a quiet confidence that I can walk away from situations that drain me, that I am worthy of so much better. The situation with my parents and Tyler is still tangled. We're trying to weave something new from the remnants of the old, fractured threads. It's delicate, flawed, undoubtedly imperfect, but there's a genuine honesty to it that was completely absent before. I haven't forgotten the sting of their actions, the blatant unfairness surrounding the will, the countless years of being taken for granted, the obvious favoritism that always seemed to sting just a bit more. It's always there, under the surface, but it's not controlling me anymore. Sarah and I have been seriously discussing marriage lately, talking about creating our own family, a foundation built on mutual love and unwavering respect, not obligation or lingering guilt. The irony of it all isn't lost on me, though. I had to essentially lose my family, witness their own personal freefall, in order to truly discover myself and start to rebuild something real. But isn't that just life in a nutshell? Some of the most agonizing lessons are the ones that ultimately shape us. Sometimes, you have to completely shatter something to reconstruct it in a better, stronger form. And occasionally, just occasionally, what emerges from the ashes is infinitely more resilient than what existed before. The last time I drove past my parents' old house, it was no longer their house. New owners had moved in, a young, vibrant couple with a rambunctious toddler and a happy-go-lucky golden retriever. They'd painted the exterior a bright, cheerful blue and planted a riot of colorful flowers in the front yard. Looking at it, I felt nothing. No lingering nostalgia, no simmering anger, just emptiness. Neutrality. And somehow, that felt like a significant victory. That's definitely progress, I think. Even Tyler has transformed in ways I genuinely never thought possible. He holds down a full-time job now, diligently pays his own bills, and has even enrolled in night classes at the local community college. It's small steps, but they're big changes for him. Just last week, he actually asked for my advice about investments. Not money itself, but actual advice on how to manage it. Spreadsheets lay between us on my kitchen table. It was a surreal moment, really. For what felt like the first time ever, my brother and I were just siblings. No undercurrent of rivalry, no simmering bitterness, just two people trying to untangle a mess. He confessed, almost sheepishly, "I never thought I'd admit this, but I'm actually grateful for how everything played out. It forced me to confront some things and finally grow up." I kept my own thoughts to myself. Part of me wished things had been entirely different. I longed for the validation of being truly valued by my parents, of being included in their plans, their legacy. It stung, realizing how little I mattered in that context. But there's no denying I'm grateful for the resilience I discovered in the aftermath, for the strength I found when I finally stopped allowing myself to be a doormat. My therapist has a way of putting things into perspective. She calls it the distinction between acceptance and approval. I can acknowledge what happened, accept the reality of it, without condoning it, without agreeing that it was right or fair. It's a concept I'm constantly trying to internalize. To anyone who's ever felt exploited, taken for granted, or used for your generosity, please remember your inherent worth is not defined by what you contribute. Sometimes, the bravest and most important thing you can do is walk away, drawing a firm line in the sand. It's a message that needs to resonate for both parties, them and you. Looking back, if I had possessed the clarity and conviction I have now, I would have established those boundaries years ago. It's liberating to know that I'm building them now. That realization has to be enough. I still offer my parents assistance on occasion, but it's on my terms now. When I choose to, because I genuinely want to, not out of obligation or expectation.